Hi, I'm Cynthia Nichols, the Regional Public Engagement Specialist for the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. Thanks for joining us today on Views from Ukraine. In today's conversation, our experts are discussing what exactly is happening in Ukraine. If you are in our main Zoom session, please remember to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras. The moderator might have a poor signal at times today, so if he asks a question, we will add it to the chat so you can follow along. After 45 minutes, our panel will go into private breakout rooms to answer questions from the media in attendance. As a reminder, the panel is being recorded, but the breakout rooms are not. All conversations are on the record. And now I'll hand it over to our moderator, Press Attaché for the US Embassy in Kyiv, Dan Langenkamp. Dan?
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm the Press Attaché at US Embassy Kyiv, but I'm actually in Lviv today. As many people know, the U.S. Embassy decided to draw down U.S. diplomats in Kyiv and pull back a core staff of embassy officers to Lviv, and that's where I am. As we speak, there are more than 150,000 troops surrounding Ukraine, with 7,000 troops in just the last few days moving to Ukraine's borders. Secretary Blinken and other U.S. officials have said that despite claims, Russia's claims that it is withdrawing troops, we've seen no evidence of that. And in fact, we continue to believe that Russia has put in place the pieces to stage an incursion or an invasion anywhere in the country at any time. So against this, the Russian officials, of course, continue to spread disinformation, and we are very, very concerned about a false flag operation. We're seeing an uptick in fighting along the whole line of demarcation today, with a kindergarten being destroyed or partially destroyed in Luhansk, in the government-controlled territory, something that has not been specifically attributed to Russian proxy forces, but which we suspect is. It's not clear what their motivations are, whether to terrorize the population or to stage a provocation that would incite Ukrainian forces to fight back. In any event, we find ourselves in Ukraine, all over the country, on a bit of a knife's edge. And that's why today we have three experts that have come here to speak with us about the current state of affairs in Ukraine and in negotiations with Russia. First of all, we have Yevhen Fedchenko, the co-founder and chief editor of the fact-checking website stopfake.org. We also have Orysia Lutsevych, the head of the Ukraine Forum and research fellow in the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. And then we have Volodymyr Dubovik, an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and director of the Center for International Studies in Odessa at the Meltnikov National University. Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate your being here today. Let's just jump into our conversation. What do you all make of the statements by the Russian officials that they are withdrawing troops from around Ukraine after these exercises? Do we take those at face value? How do we evaluate that language, given what we know about the posture of Russian forces on the border? And let's go to Orysia first.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for joining us today. It's key to keep attention on Ukraine, and thanks so many of you who are covering the escalation. I just came off here to our conversation after Chatham House research event that was looking at open source intelligence about what is happening on the ground. And our analysts say, do not believe de-escalation. Russia will be doing redeployments, maybe close even to Ukraine border. The units are still remaining mobilized, and they're in full combat readiness and can be mobilized fast. So we may see more or less temporary deployments, but these may remain actually permanent. They could be turned into permanent deployments. Ground forces remain at the forward operating positions, and we see Donbass, occupied parts of Ukrainian Donbass, preparing for the military exercises, obviously conducted by and directed by Russian military. Crimea remains heavily armed and are landing ships positioned in the Black Sea that could potentially reach Ukrainian coastal cities. And of course, in Belarus, the light resolve military exercises that will take place till the 20th of February remain, in quite active phase. And even Russia may withdraw some troops, the assets may remain on the ground. So this is the message from what we see on the ground, and we take it as the war of attrition and the nerve-wracking situation where obviously disinformation actually could be used to engineer military intervention.
I see. So look at actions, not words, essentially, is what you're saying. Don't believe the de-escalation, I think is the exact quote, right? Yevhen, what do you think about, a lot of what we have seen so far has been accompanied by a campaign of disinformation. What are the narratives that we're seeing right now?
So we don't see the escalation with information warfare as well. So just the opposite, we see the huge upstick in number of disinformation narratives. Dozens of them are simultaneously distributed to very different audiences in different languages, using very different platforms. The main narrative of the last days is preparation of pretext to further military incursion, and we've seen the spike of fake news related to genocide and atrocities allegedly perpetrated by Ukrainian armed forces in Donbass. So that started a couple of days ago, but actually this narrative is not new. So Stop Fake first started to spot the increase of the usage of this very narrative since last November. And now we see how Russia started to actively use it and repurpose it. And we hear the word genocide coming from all the places, including President Putin, who is repeating all the time that Ukraine is doing Srebrenica and other sins. We hear a lot about Ukrainian armed forces preparation for ethnic cleansing. And actually today's events with bombardment of kindergarten was another example how Russia wants to recatch a strategic narrative and try to portray Ukraine actually as aggressor and perpetrator of crimes over here. So just to remind that in the early morning, Ukrainian kindergarten was allegedly shelled or was impacted by other kind of weapons. And then immediately we saw how Russian sources of very different levels started to disseminate information that it was Ukraine that shelled kindergarten on across the contact line in Donbass, allegedly saying it's not under Ukrainian government's control, but on the other side. And we've seen a lot of sources participating in this operation, distributing this information. And also we've seen how it immediately was picked up by Russian traditional media like newspapers, Moskovsky Komsomolets and others as a fait accompli, even when it was already debunked and explained that it actually happened on Ukraine's side of the contact line, and it was shelled from the opposite side of the contact line by Russian-controlled forces, not the other way around.
So let me understand this correctly. Russian proxies or Russian forces apparently shelled a side on the Ukrainian shelled a school on the Ukrainian controlled side of the line of demarcation.
Yeah,
so
actually it was kindergarten and a school as a separate instance.
Kindergarten and a school. 2 teachers were injured, I understand, and then power in the town has actually gone out, and people have fled to a basement or a shelter of some sort.
Including students who were at both schools, school and kindergarten at the time of the shelling. So again, we see how they are trying to organize a false flag operation.
But how is this a false flag? So you're saying they're shelling, are they trying to provoke Ukrainian forces to respond? Or are they trying to claim that this is an attack by Ukraine on a Russian language?
Actually, it was both. So they wanted to do both things at the same time. So they wanted to provoke Ukraine to answer the fire. And the second, they wanted to create the narrative that actually Ukraine is shelling kids. And this is very powerful narrative, and that shows us what kind of narratives they want to shape around Ukraine.
I see. Let me interrupt so that Volodymyr can add his perspective here. Volodymyr, what do you think about this latest upsurge in fighting that we're seeing and this shelling of this school?
Well, I think a number of things, though troubling, unfortunately. In terms of how do we know when Moscow is lying, it brings me back to the famous saying, like, how do you know anyone is lying when he or she opens their mouth, so that's exactly what's happening with Kremlin propaganda. Every time they out with a message, it's most of the time is not true. In many cases, in most cases, it's opposite to the truth. So it's very interesting, and what's going on with the shelling. We already kind of explored that. So first of all, they want to try and show it as the Ukrainians are shelling these peaceful objects and civilians. And it's very important now to be quick with spreading this information, the correct information, the unbiased, obviously, from the ground. And it helps a lot that right now, these days, there's a lot of Western journalists now in Ukraine. Well, not many of them embedded, obviously, along the contact line, but many in Kyiv, and they get quick information, including directly from Ukrainian military in the trenches. So the situation is unique. They're getting their sources there. But that's very important, because otherwise Russia outrushes us, and they sell us as this episode as Ukrainians shelling the kindergarten. So it's very important to be the first and say, no, just the contrary happened, all right? And they're trying, of course, as well to provoke Ukraine to return the fire. And I can't even imagine our soldiers sitting in those trenches and taking that fire and not returning the fire, because I've already heard several times today that under the current intensity of the fire, usually Ukrainians would be returning some fire, but not today, not right now, because they don't want to give them any pretext for the invasion.
And the Ukrainian soldiers that I've spoken with have talked about the strictness of their rules of engagement, that they are really only allowed to return fire when it is in self-defense. And I understood that was reinforced to them today. Let me ask this question. One of the big strategies in the United States is to try to expose these strategies, expose the Russian playbook so that it upsets President Putin's planning, which we don't have any insight into, really. We don't exactly know whether he's made a decision to invade Ukraine or not. What do you all think about this strategy? I mean, we are trying to change his calculus. Is this aggressive playbook, our playbook, is this aggressive strategy to try to expose these false flag operations? Is that a sensible way to go, or are we just simply creating panic, like some people have said? And let's go back to Orysia. Maybe we'll just go around the circle real quick.
I think it's very important to actually remind ourselves what I believe is a genius long telegram by George Kennan, who actually says at that time, the very disrespect of Russians for objective truth. I mean, this is what continues and Russian leadership perpetrates today. It means that they use all stated facts and instruments for furtherance of their hidden agenda. And this is the operational field we are. There's no respect for truth. And Russia tries to maintain this implausible deniability from the time of annexation of Crimea to the downing of MH17. What we need to do is we need to call a spade a spade. We need to expose and investigate crimes against Ukrainians, against human rights, against humanities to a certain degree. And I think the fact that United States is sharing and UK is sharing some intelligence in open source, it's a good, I would say, deterrence or by communication. I think I would probably say pinpointing the date of the invasion or calling it imminent. We could discuss whether this was the best strategy, but I think absolutely exposing Russian true endgame. So that it cannot play either the role of the mediator when it's an aggressor, or try to wrap things in the smoke of this ambiguity and false news is key. And I think this is important, especially for European countries, for countries like Germany, France, where there's much more, I would say, a mood for either appeasement or just trying to lower down the tensions, why it's actually Russia that is rising the stakes. Russia that is trying to motion, for example, recognition of the independence of parts of occupied Donbass that are Ukrainian legitimate territory. So I would say we need to use strategic communication, understanding our end game, and our end game is to preserve Ukraine's territorial integrity, to get Russia out of Ukraine, to keep Russia contained, and to basically stop revanchist moves that we are seeing is a strategic objective of Kremlin.
Thank you. So, Yevhen, there's been some discussion in Ukraine that this strategy is actually just creating panic. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. From my point of view, it's absolutely great strategy because in Ukraine there is no panic. Ukraine is at war for last 8 years, and I think the Ukrainians were capable of build kind of inner resilience towards this. So it's not about sowing panic among Ukrainians, but that's really about what Orysia said about revealing Putin plans. And because Putin and his system can operate only in the shadow. And so we do not need to be afraid of making those things public. We don't need to be afraid of provoking Putin, as someone might call it, that some of our actions can provoke Putin. Putin can act without any provocation. He actually doesn't need us to start any further incursion. So he might just invent those things completely, even if he doesn't have all those pretexts, So yes, Ukrainian army is not returning fire, but it doesn't mean that he and his propaganda cannot invent all those things. So we don't need to be afraid of exposing all those things. And we don't need to be intimidated by Russia trying to, for example, making fun of that, because I've been watching Russian television earlier today, and they are all fun, about that, and where is your incursion, which you've been promising? But probably incursion did not happen exactly because that we knew exactly how it's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And that what actually prevented it. So that was very, very important strategy from my point of view. And many, many Ukrainians share the same view on this.
Interesting. Volodymyr, how is the mood in Odessa? I can tell you that in Lviv, people are calm. They're concerned, but they're calm. What about down there?
Then, if I may, a few things in a continuation of our discussion, because after all, U.S.-Ukraine relations is my field of studies. I think what U.S. is doing is a great job. It's a great game.
Wait, are you guys paid to say this, or are you just saying this because I'm on the line, or is this
both?
Point of view?
Right. No, I actually believe that. Because first of all, it's a great sign of a real partnership and responsibility. You know what? I think there is some kind of saying along the lines that is, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck or something like that. So if it looks like a preparation for invasion, we call it like this, and publicly. The time when Washington would see it and would channel it to Kiev, not publicly, is long gone. There's no time for that. You need to do it publicly. You need to expose them right away. And that's what they're doing. And there's understanding militarily that there is a window for Russia to intervene, to invade, and this window is kind of shrinking. So every time you kind of undermine their plans to invade on this or that day, that window is kind of shrinking. And there is still a huge window, unfortunately.
There's another window. Yeah, go ahead.
It's getting smaller. So it's very responsible. It's working. It's upsetting Putin. I think in few public appearances in recent days, we saw him being really upset. It's not working how he was planning it to work. So that's interesting. And but then again, they're going back to the subject of military technical, tools or steps, and they are. Just being revealed a response that they worked over it for 3 weeks for the security proposals that they first vented on December 17th. It's pretty much going back to Circle 1 when they said it's either strategic package priority for us or nothing, or we go to these military technical tools.
There's this narrative there's this question that this is playing, this warning them is playing into Russia's hands by destabilizing Ukraine, by hurting the economy and keeping people on edge.
Look,
you don't see it that way.
No, I don't. I think the invasion would actually hurt the Ukrainian economy much more than destabilizing Ukrainian economy just by saying that invasion is possible. So it's a more responsible way to do it.
And I think what Volodymyr said also, it's Russian cyber attack that took place in January and now 2 days ago that is destabilizing Ukraine, and it's a Russian blockade of the Black and Azov Sea that is destabilizing Ukrainian economy and threatening shipment of cereals, actually threatening global food security if Ukrainian grain ports are blocked. So I think, of course, there's a collateral damage, let's put it this way, side effects of anxiety over possible aggression, but I think it keeps everybody vigilant and it builds Ukraine's resilience to remain in extended periods of tensions without undermining key function of Ukrainian state.
But also going back to your question then about situation in Odessa, of course, it's certainly a chance. I mean, we are geographically located in such a vulnerable way. We're close to Transnistria. We're not too far from Crimea. We've been knowing that they've been practicing all sorts of operations, including using, sea landing and also maybe paratroopers or something like that. So we don't know what they're planning to do necessarily. It's a problem for us, and puts people on the edge. I mean, it depends who you talk to. So still a lot of people around Odessa who are saying is, I just can't think about it as a real thing. It's probably not going to happen. But many people are worried. People with kids, little kids are already thinking about this little panic bags and packing them, and maybe even sending away, let's say, the youngest ones away from Odessa. Because we don't know. I mean, and also, unfortunately, Odessa is a big thing in Russia's Putin's thinking about this Russian world. The new Russia, the Novorossiya concept is probably not entirely dead. Who knows? They might come back to it now using this military technical tools or something. And Odessa is a crown jewel. If any city in Ukraine that they would think is a really Russian city right after Sevastopol, that would be Odessa. And also, I'm afraid that they keep in mind those tragic events of May of 2014, when people died in Odessa in that fire, that terrible fire. And I'm afraid that some people in Moscow might want to avenge those events and replay them, but now with them prevailing. So there is a combination of factors that really make Odessa a dangerous place, one of those spots on the map that you might expect them to try to hit. But of course, you don't know, because they're stretching the front. That's the whole idea. You don't know where they're going to hit. Will there be several incursions at the same time, or one major? You just don't know. Will they actually cross the border? There are so many options. I know initially Washington said there have been 18 scenarios to respond to what Russia does, but right now I think it's probably even more than 18 because there is so many things they can do in terms of hybrid warfare and in terms of actually conventional, regular warfare. And it puts many of us in various places in Ukraine in a tense situation.
I want to apologize for the music, and because I'm in a hotel and we're at this location, I had to move because of another event. Let me just ask the question about the LNR and the DPR resolution. Our audience will probably know about this, but I wanted to ask our panelists what that meant in terms of this conflict. Does it concern you? Do you think that President Putin is going to sign that, or is he holding it in his pocket as a piece of leverage? Orysia, what do you think?
Well, just briefly, I think by having even this motion, this appeal passed in the Russian Duma yesterday or 2 days ago, it is a clear raising of the stakes. This is another example of escalation rather than de-escalation. It's a certain statement to, again, threatening Ukrainian territorial integrity. Obviously, it's against all the international laws and UN Charter. And then I think that also would be the last nail in the coffin of Minsk Agreements if Russia recognizes the alleged independence of these statelets. Obviously, it will undermine already existing fragile diplomatic dialogue along the lines of possible conflict resolution. And then I think this could also give a pretext for military invasion, because if we remember what happened with the annexation of Crimea, there was appeal of local government, a local parliament, for Russia to provide security assistance to the peninsula. They may stage a similar appeal from the illegally recognized LNR and DNR for Russian peacekeepers. And that would give them, because remember, Putin likes to find these legal tweaks and twists to justify his aggression in the eyes of Russian population. Either he is fighting US and NATO in Ukraine, not Ukrainians, or he is defending Russian speakers and Russian citizens that he gave illegally, again, Russian passports in Ukraine. So I think it's another theater of escalation that we should carefully watch. And that's why also this narrative of alleged genocide is very worrying. Russian State Investigative Committee officially launched an investigation into the genocide, again, could give another pretext for Putin to order military invasion based on that false fact.
Let me go to Volodymyr for this one. I feel sorry because he's third in line in my questioning. Volodymyr, are there any parallels with Kosovo here? You know,
Dan,
Kosovo that took place and then bombing campaign. What was
right? Okay, at some point your sound was breaking, but I got the Kosovo out of it. So
okay,
yes,
sorry about that.
initially, early on, Russia was using Kosovo very actively with Crimea, and then of course back in 2014, we fought quotation marks very aggressively, all of us, against it, because saying it's a very kind of a false parallel. It's not working. You know, it's a completely different environment, different situation, and so on. Because after all, in Kosovo, there was a massive exodus of peaceful population, civilians, and there was a pressure from Belgrade and military forces of the Yugoslav army. In case of Crimea, nothing of the sort was happening. But let's not go back and revisit the 2014. We all know what happened with that sham referendum in March of 2014. But with what's going on now with LNR and DNR, I mean, it was clear from day one that Russia is not prepared to release Donbass back into Ukraine's fold on Ukraine's terms. That is clear. Everything else is open up for speculation. Like, I mean, they can actually recognize them, not recognize them. They can actually push the borders. And that will be, of course, an incursion, minor or medium size. And that will be actually an invasion, push the borders a little bit. To occupy entirely these two big districts, Luhansk and Donetsk territorial units. They can think about annexation, probably not. This conflict is not frozen, obviously, but there is a price that Ukraine has been paying for it not being frozen, and that's with the blood of Ukrainian soldiers. All right, because on the one hand, if it's frozen, well, okay, no one is killing or wounding Ukrainian soldiers on a daily basis. But that means Donbass probably would be getting in a line with Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and other places where any settlement is very remote, and most people think that might never happen. So we've been trying not have it frozen actually for this 8 years, almost 8 years now. But there is a price, and now, of course, the price can even increase if they up the stakes, up the ante, and they keep pushing with more military troops there. So whatever the plan is with Donbass it's very important indeed to undermine those plans in real time. Like I said, there is a rush with what's going on. If there's genocide, no, you need to go back and explain, no, there is no genocide, not whatsoever. I'm Russian speaking, Odessa and Ukrainian. I mean, no one is genociding against me, nor discriminating me. I mean, most of my friends in Odessa, we're Russian speakers. We never felt any discrimination. What are you talking about? Liberating Russian speakers, so ethnic Russians. Go talk to the Ukrainian troops in the trenches. Most of them respond in Russian. And if you actually look at their documents, you would discover many of them ethnic Russians as well. So that's completely irrelevant. I mean, it's definitely just used by Russian propaganda, and that needs to be explained to the West. And right now, there are two major audiences here, both important for Putin. One in Russia, because there have been sociological polls showing that Russians are not enthusiastic about the big war against Ukraine. So he's trying to sell the war. And if he would say, look, but they're killing ethnic Russians, so what can we do? We need to protect them. And there are hundreds of thousands of them with Russian passports as well. Well, it might work with Russian audience. And then it's very important not to lose the audience elsewhere, to try and explain in better terms in a quick way, in an expedient way, that what Russia is saying is complete lies. There is no genocide, there's no discrimination. They're just trying to push the invasion further into Ukraine.
That is fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about the Minsk Agreements. Our audience may not understand this set of agreements actually that was signed in 2014 and early 2015. Now, the Minsk agreements say or commit the parties to reintegrating the Donbass back into Ukraine. And that's this explicit term. So by passing a resolution that would, passing a resolution or signing onto a resolution that made them independent would basically scuttle the Minsk agreements entirely, correct? Now, Minsk is a controversial agreement in Ukraine. There are a lot of government officials that don't like it. Can someone explain why there are Ukrainians who don't, even Ukrainian officials who unofficially say they don't like it? Maybe Volodymyr, you can help us with that, or Orysia.
Oh, me again? Okay.
Right, sure. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I mean, any of us can, of course. Well, Minsk, we don't like Minsk for several reasons. First of all, both Minsk were kind of imposed on us with a gun against the head of Ukraine because of two major kind of military losses there, defeats, first at the Ilovaisk and then at the Debaltsevo. No one ever liked it, even when we signed it, and then we knew it. And I think when Mr. Poroshenko was signing it, he also understood that there will be now a big game in trying not to implement it in the way that Russia wanted it to be implemented. And there are discrepancies, there are differences. We've been always saying, let's do security first. And I think even based on common sense, it does make sense. Let's disarm first. Let's Ukraine get back control of the border. Let's put all these observers massively into the region. Wait a little bit. Allow all the political parties to have their campaigns and present their positions and slogans and so on, and then have elections. Why not? What's wrong with that? But then Russia, of course, saying, no, let's just do those elections right now, right away, with all this militia, so-called militia, and of course, Russian troops as well. So in a similar way to what was happening in March in 2014 in Crimea. So Ukraine is definitely opposing to that. And of course, we've been trying to commit to, to implement what we can, but we always been saying, but look at the other side. They're not doing anything to reciprocate, so that's been another thing. Ukrainians were saying we're trying at the domestic political risk, because some of the things we're trying to do are actually, detrimental to our security, and a big portion of our population doesn't like it a lot. It's a huge risk for Zelensky. Right now, I think Russia is seeing that Zelensky is not going to implement Minsk in the Russian way. And that's one of the reasons Russia is saying, okay, let's bury the Minsk then. I suppose so. And sending all sorts of signals in all directions, including sending second in the U.S. embassy today away from Moscow for some reason, unexplained reason. Yeah, many signals.
Now, so Yevhen, let's go to Yevhen for a second, because there is a disinformation element to what Russia says about Minsk, and we'll just touch on this briefly, because I think we should have a whole discussion, perhaps next week, about what Minsk is. It's such a complex set of problems when you talk about it. But Yevhen, Russia says it's not a party to the conflict, and Russia says that Ukraine is not implementing the Minsk agreements. Is that true? Or either of those things?
That's what try to persuade anyone. So they come to Minsk agreement with very kind of big flexibility, and every time they actually need it, then can use it for their own purposes. But every time they can avoid responsibilities, they can always say, we are not a part of it, sorry about that. So that's just to give a kind of brief description what their attitude towards Minsk is in terms of the disinformation narrative. So basically they use it very widely for their explanatory purposes, and they build a lot of their fake narratives around Minsk agreement and what Ukraine can do, what Ukraine cannot do. For example, they're insisting that Ukraine should sit and talk to so-called local leaders from DNR and LNR, and that's not what Minsk agreement actually demanded. And a couple of days ago, they even called Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba Goebbels, because he said that we never seen that clause in Minsk agreement that we need to directly talk to those people in Donetsk and Lugansk. So that's kind of very interesting point.
Right. What did they call him? Goebbels? What is that?
Yes. So because allegedly he's lying so furiously just to avoid, responsibility and other things. So basically to say that he's a big liar and he's doing propaganda rather than, looking into facts, And this is very interesting because that's just one of the evidences how they manipulate the topic of Minsk agreement.
Okay, thank you. Orysia, what do you, let's turn to a different subject now. Where do we go from here? What is the next, phases of this conflict, in your view? What do we need to look for in terms of Russia and the United States and Ukraine and the European Union and NATO?
Well, just briefly, I think we have to all understand that we're here for the long haul. If we are serious about European security, if we are willing to, appease, and if we are willing to compromise on the values of sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries, we may resolve this conflict. But I don't think this is what President Biden said is in Americans' national interest. It is definitely not something that is in Ukrainian national interest. It means that we are here positioned for a midterm, let's hope it's midterm, perhaps even long-term strategic rivalry and tension with the Russian Federation because of irreconcilable strategic objectives of Russian Federation, European Union, NATO, United States, and honestly democratic global world. And I think what we need to be gearing towards is supporting Ukraine in its ability to defend itself. And that includes from military to economic assistance, from building capacity in cyber to looking at alternative trade routes. That also means reclaiming the narrative about what is going on. And here, because we are talking to journalists, I think we need to start speaking directly to the Russian people. This is why I think we should all invest our resources. When high-level officials are going to Moscow giving conferences, they should not only be addressing, what Kremlin says, it's also about the future of Russia. It's not just about the future of Ukraine. And I think we have to very clearly explain the differences between, one thing I want to say, perhaps just to wrap up, when Biden became president, it was clear that China is becoming the main strategic rival of the United States. It still remains the case, but there was a fear of Russia-Chinese alliance against the democratic world. I personally think we should not be afraid of this alliance because Russia will be the younger brother in the strong embrace of China. And actually this strategy that is not in Russia's national interest will create cleavage internally in Russia, where Russian people and elite will definitely choose the West eventually, and eventually will be able to talk about shared security and Europe free from Lisbon to Vladivostok. I honestly believe in this, but we just have to be patient.
I thought it was interesting. Thomas Friedman today in the New York Times said, China doesn't have allies, it has vassals. And that implies that Russia would be just a vassal state of a much larger and more powerful China. Let me ask Volodymyr, what do you think about the Finland question? Everybody is talking about whether Ukraine should be independent and not join NATO and stuff like that. It's a big discussion, but maybe just your top thoughts on that idea.
In the longer run, Ukraine cannot remain independent and not being member of NATO. There are many options here on the table, but actually being part of this collective security arrangement in the longer run, a strategic perspective, that's the only thing which actually keeps us secure to some extent. Because any other leaves us in that limbo, in this gray zone, vacuum security zone, which we've been warning about for years and years. Ever since the Budapest Memorandum been signed in '94, Ukrainian experts have been talking about that. That is not sufficient. It's not viable. It's not working. And yet people pretended, including here in Ukraine, that this is somehow protecting us well enough against Russia. And it never did. And we knew it. That only the security, like NATO could provide, could actually help us. Right now, of course, we have to stand vis-a-vis Russia, being members or not. The good thing that NATO is helping us as an alliance, and particular countries are helping us. And that's actually what irritates Moscow very much so. When they actually say that even without Ukraine having a chance of getting closer to the membership, Ukraine is already kind of a de facto member in terms of a pace of cooperation, they actually telling the truth. And that's exactly one of the things I think that actually triggered Putin, because there is still a big discussion among our scholars. What tipped him across this red line What is this urgency? What is this anger? Why is he now saying now, all of a sudden? And there's been a number of factors, and one of them is Ukraine-NATO cooperation. But you know what, we could not, of course, allow ourselves to say we would never be members of NATO. We can talk about maybe putting it away for some time, because right now still it's not feasible. And I'm seeing Ukrainian governments trying to move in that direction, including President Zelensky mentioning several times. Well, you know what, maybe it's just a dream. Maybe we should work towards it, but we cannot reach it anytime soon. And then others, and Mr. Scholz is when he was here in Kyiv as well. But I'm afraid that Russia really wants, as you said, Finlandization. And they really need some kind of permanent neutrality treaty. And that kind of treaty is a non-starter, no-go, both for Ukraine and for our friends in NATO. And that's how it should be. And if the price for it is more pressure from Russia, so what can we do? And so let it be it, but we cannot give in on this major issue. We can do in little nuances, but not in terms of a perspective of the doors are actually open for us in the future. Thank you.
Dan, I just say one thing.
Yeah.
Stalin respected sovereignty of Finland. He was not writing articles that Finland and USSR are one people. This is what Putin does. He does not respect sovereignty of Ukraine. That's why it's a false flag operation talking about neutral Ukraine.
Yes, and that is probably another good discussion to have. The essay that President Putin wrote over the summer on the historic unity of Ukrainians and Russians would be a good discussion. That article is such an important document. When you read it, you see exactly what his worldview is, and it's not very respectful of the Ukrainian uniqueness. So Yevhen, I've been ignoring you. I'm sorry, because your perspective here is so important. Is Ukraine consigned to this gray zone between Russia and the West, where Russian disinformation is going to, forever be a problem in this country? And this will be our last question before we go to a breakout session. Is the strategy?
Ukraine is a place where the struggle of different narratives is taking place, and what Russia is now, where now Russia is aiming it, and that's quite a trend. What I've noticed is that Russia wants to sow the division between Ukrainians and the West, explaining that all this problem was instigated by US government or British government, and they want to use different channels and platforms to bring this idea back to Ukrainians and to make sure that this entire Western feelings would grow over here, and then they would explain some economic difficulties with that and political difficulties. And now they would use, again, this upstick in violence in the east of Ukraine for that very purposes. And that's also the part of their rhetoric. They want to build a narrative around this point. And this is quite strong tendency, quite a strong trend. And I already feel how they want to use it basically to sow division, because division is the main product Russia is producing and trying to move into different parts of the world. So that's my main preoccupation over here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks to all the panelists, Volodymyr, Orysia, and Yevhen. This has been a fascinating discussion today, and I'll have to cut you loose to the panel discussions or the individual discussions that you'll have. I want to thank everybody. Your insights are so interesting and valuable. I hope and I know I speak for our audience, that it was useful for everybody. I'm going to stop there. Thanks to everybody. This is Dan Langenkamp and the U.S. Embassy from Lviv. See you all next week, I hope.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dan. If you give us just a second to all our panelists and everyone who has attended the panel, we're going to stop recording so that we can go into our breakout rooms.